Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Rennie Chan, for having us here at this wonderful facility tonight. On behalf of the Harvard Club of Hong Kong, I'm just delighted to be here in the company of this outstanding panel. It's really unique to pull together a collection of so accomplished experts on the topic, and so really looking forward to a lively event. I want to extend a special thanks to the Asia Society's Penny Tang and Natalie Lau, where you raise your hand. They were tireless in helping us to set this event up. We couldn't have done it without them. Of one small housekeeping thing, which is that those of you who are here who are graduates of Harvard or related to the university but are not yet members of the Harvard Club, where is Serena Fan? Serena Fan, are you here? I can't say, okay, Serena Fan is back there. Please make sure you introduce yourself to her before the evening is over, and she will sort you out and fix that problem, because we would love to get you on our mailing list and be involved in our events, one of which is coming up in October. It'll be an event called Innovation Everywhere, and it's on the subject of innovation in Hong Kong and throughout Asia and Hong Kong's role in that. Our keynote speaker will be C.Y. Leung. We have speakers from government, from industry. We have Edward Che, who's the author of this great new book on China's disruptors. It'll be a wonderful event. It's October 24th at the Shangri-La, and you can email Lisa Boltz, who's right here, our Harvard Club administrator, and she will help to organize you if you're interested in that conference. My immediate task is to explain tonight's format and to introduce our panelists. But before I get to that, I've been asked to just say a few brief words about the context for our topic and our resolution tonight. It's fitting that we're debating the subject of a transition between from the American to the Asian century at a time when China's President Xi Jinping has landed in the United States, has kind of made his opening speech in the U.S. He's off to a very bold start. It's been quite impressive to see the program that he's got lined up. Those of you who've been following the news will know that he has arrived with practically a kind of terracotta army of business people with him. I was just looking at the Wall Street Journal's website this afternoon. They estimate that the net worth of the Jack Ma's and Pony Ma's and Robin Lee's and everyone that is in Xi's entourage is just short of $1 trillion. So China has very definitely stood up, I think. He'll be doing a full set of events that starts really only in a few hours, speaking to business and tech leaders from the U.S., and he'll be dining with Bill Gates. So it's a pretty imposing way to start his journey, and it's caused a lot of consternation in the other Washington, where he'll be traveling later in the week to meet with President Obama. The White House had hoped that he would kind of stick to the White House script. He's diverged right off that in a real show of confidence and of China's growing strength. Well, let me say a word about this notion that's behind our resolution, the idea that centuries belong to a particular nation or a particular region. In framing the topic the way that we have, we really are kind of referring back to a classic, famous American essay that was written in 1941 by the publisher of Allen's magazine, Henry Luce, the great founder of Time Inc., who wrote in February of 1941 an essay that was called The American Century. That was this kind of clarion call to his countrymen against isolationism and an urge to embrace America's destiny as the most powerful nation in the world, the beacon of democracy, of freedom, and economic progress for everyone else to follow, and for everyone to benefit from America's vigorous leadership. The essay was in part a rebuke to Franklin Roosevelt, who Luce detested, and was at the time on the fence, couldn't decide whether to bring America into the war on behalf of the British, to stick up for the values that he believed in so much. The interesting thing about Luce is that Luce was actually not born in America. He was born in China. He was raised in Shandong province. He was the son of Presbyterian missionaries and had this very kind of romanticized view of America, like a lot of expat kids who have never really been to their home country. I think my kids are a little bit like that. So he brought that romanticized notion of America to bear in this essay, and he combined it with the evangelical zeal of his upbringing and urged Americans to embrace what he called their destiny. Well, 10 months after that essay was published, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's hand was forced. America entered the war, and 4 years later, it emerged as by far and away the world's largest colossus. No one could rival America for its power, and it clearly was, just as Luce had prophesied, the American century. My old Harvard professor, Joe Nye, has written a wonderful book that just published a few months ago called Is the American Century Over? And in that book, Joe argues that the idea of the American century was rooted in three dimensions of understandings of power: economic power, military power, and something that he calls soft power. Well, economically, America had no rival at all after the war. The economies of all the rest of the world had been virtually decimated. America was unscathed. Militarily, America had unquestionable superiority over almost every other nation. At the height of its power, for the first half of the century, it was constrained by the Soviet Union, but at the height of its power, American naval superiority was about 17 times, it was equal to the next 17 nations' navies all combined. It led in its space, in cyberspace. It really had no rival at all. And on soft power, America had created most of the post-war multilateral institutions. It set up the rules for commerce, for trade, for diplomacy. And it's very, not just its ideals, but its lifestyle and even its popular culture had broad universal appeal. So when is it that we started talking about this idea of the possibility of an Asian century? If the American century started in 41, what would be the right way to date a possible Asian century? Well, we'll hear more about that tonight, but one moment in which the seeds of the Asian century were clearly planted, I think, was the 1979 visit of Deng Xiaoping to the United States. Very different from the visit that's going on right now. Deng portrayed himself as almost a kind of a folksy, bemused tourist. He went where his U.S. handlers basically instructed him to go. He showed up at Houston. He ate some Texas barbecue. He donned a 10-gallon hat, smiled to the camera, and waved. He seemed to be a very down-home sort. And that was in keeping with his philosophy of hide your brightness. He knew China's strength, its size, its scale. He knew China had a lot of work to do, but he didn't believe that it was in China's best interest to demonstrate that and show it off. Well, the current president of China has very different views about that. Not only is he building islands in the South China Sea to extend China's naval power and sovereign claims, he is showing up with his entourage, and he is willing to take China's military brightness and parade it right down the middle of Beijing on the Avenue of Heavenly Peace for everyone to see. So it's a very different era. Let me say something just very quickly about our format tonight. It's pretty straightforward. This will be an Oxford-style debate. Panelists are divided into two teams to debate for and against the following motion. The American century will give way to the Asian century on or before the year 2041. That's 100 years from Henry Luce's essay, when the American century, we think, could arguably be said to have started. Arguing for the affirmative, Team Asia will be Fred Hu and Kevin Sneeder, on my right. Fred Hu is the chairman and founder of Primavera Capital Group, a China-based global investment firm. He was chairman for Greater China at Goldman Sachs, and before that, he was an official at the IMF. He has an undergraduate degree from Tsinghua University and earned his PhD in economics from Harvard. Kevin Sneeder is the Asia chairman at McKinsey & Company, where he's a member of the firm's operating committee. He joined McKinsey in 1989 and has served in offices in Beijing, Paris, Hong Kong, Washington, and London. He has a law degree from the University of Glasgow and was a Baker and Fulbright scholar at Harvard Business School. So, Team Asia is heavily stacked with Harvard people over here. Arguing for the negative of the resolution, Team America, will be Alan Murray and Professor Zhang Baohui. Alan Murray is the editor of Fortune magazine, where he oversees the print magazine, the digital properties, and Fortune's global events and conferences. He is the former president of the Pew Research Center, and before that served as deputy managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. Alan is a graduate of the University of North Carolina and has a master's from the London School of Economics. He's a regular commentator on business and politics on U.S. television and one of America's most experienced and respected journalists. And finally, Zhangbao Hui is a professor of political science and the director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Studies at Lingnan University. He's the author of numerous books and articles about China and Sino-US relations and has over a decade of teaching experience in the United States. He earned his PhD from the University of Texas in Austin. So my role here is to be not Team Asia or Team America, but sort of Team Switzerland. I'm in the middle to referee. And I'd like to start, before we begin the debate, the actual debate, to invite our audience to vote for or against the proposition, to find out where opinion in this room stands. Then we'll dive in. We'll have 2 rounds of remarks. Each panelist will have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll go around again, allowing 3 minutes for rebuttal and to offer new arguments and respond to any of the comments made by the opposing debaters. After opening statements and rebuttal, we'll allow about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience, and then I'll call for a second vote to learn whether the motion has failed or carried. But more interestingly, the real question tonight is going to be to see which team can be more successful in shifting opinion, persuading audience members to change their vote. So I've really asked our participants, especially in their opening statements, to push and argue as vehemently and robustly as they can for their position. I know that they have very nuanced views about the world, but we want to hear their best barrister arguments on behalf of the proposition. So without further ado, let's start by taking a vote. Do I have someone from the Asia Society here that can help me kind of count noses? Maybe it'll be obvious. Here's the resolution again. The American century will give way to the Asian century on or before the year 2041. How many people believe that resolution is true? Affirmative. How many votes do we have? Let's see. Wow, a lot. Look at this. Jeez, we must be in Asia.
We have a challenge.
Can we count them?
We have a problem.
Wow, that is really the prevailing view. A confident 2041. Seems like a long time, right?
And opposite reason, I can easily see.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, it would have been much faster.
Yeah.
You got a close head count? We got about 100 and... Huh? 45. Okay. Who think that resolution is nonsense? It's wrong. Oh, actually, it's a pretty good split.
So he voted twice.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, that's right. No voting twice.
I think my wife voted twice. My wife voted twice. My daughter started voting.
I should.
Yeah, you can't vote.
I'm arguing. I can.
You're like the tiebreaker. Okay. What do we think? 45.
Excellent.
Okay, we have at least 120 people here in this room here tonight. So, okay, we're going to call that an even split. All right? Okay, very interesting then. Well, without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to go around in alphabetical order of family name, starting with the affirmative team. So that means, Fred, you have 5 minutes to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Clay. If Henry Louis had been alive, undoubtedly he would have declared, after a century of glory and leadership for America, is Asian century now. A nation's global status and power, both soft and hard, mostly derived from and determined by its economic strength. Without a strong economic foundation, military, political, or cultural strength may be eroded over time and certainly cannot last long. There has been clearly a tectonic shift in the redistribution of global economic power since 3.5 decades ago, since Deng Xiaoping made that visit to the US. And will usher a new era when China and Asia will reassume a central preeminent leadership role in the world. Very much like the rise of America in the first half of the 20th century, China has been the dominant economic story globally for the last 3 decades and a half, with the fastest GDP growth, fastest industrialization and urbanization on a scale unseen previously in human history, transforming the country from abject poverty into a solid middle-income country, a global manufacturing powerhouse, and the largest export country. As China makes the transition to a new growth model anchored on middle-class consumption, service sector expansion, innovation, and environmentally friendly industries, China will most likely, no guarantee, but most likely, continue to grow at a moderately rapid pace for another 2 or 3 decades until it fully closes the gap, the income gap with the US, and converge in technology and productive performance. By mid-century, so let's say be conservative, by 2050, okay, if not 2041, China will have recaptured the title as the world's largest economy, a status it had previously occupied for much of the recorded human history. It will still have the largest population, maybe second largest, overtaken by India, who knows? But, undoubtedly, there will be the largest middle-class population in the world with the living standards among the highest in the developed world by then. China will be also among the few most dynamic and innovative economies in the world, with the rising number of globally leading technology companies. The Chinese yuan will be firmly established as a leading global reserve currency. China will have one of the largest, deepest, and best functioning financial systems. Hong Kong here and Shanghai will be 2 of the world's leading international financial centers. AIIB, have you heard of it? BRICS Bank, and the to-be-established Asian Monetary Fund will assume an equally important, most likely even more important, role as today's Bretton Woods institutions, such as World Bank and IMF. Asia, the most populous region in the world, already with 3 of the world's top 8 largest economies, will reclaim its rightful place on the global stage, led by China, importantly, here clearly, supported by Japan, a unified Korea, India, Indonesia, and other smaller but equally prosperous nations, bounded by a high degree of economic interdependence. I'm at a disadvantage because I speak English. I should speak Chinese. Increased political trust and historical reconciliation, shared security interest, and tied closely together by a range of new Pan-Asia regional institutions, will rise to become the gravity center of global economy, technology, politics, and culture. Alan, you should move to Hong Kong. Asia will, once and for all, under the global dominance of the US. The US has maintained over the past 100 years. It can be credibly declared 21st century is an Asian century, with Asian nations, most notably China, taking a driving seat on global affairs, be they economic, financial, climate change, or pandemics. For my many good American friends here in this room, don't despair. I always admire America, and I appreciate many strengths, advantages in America. The Asia's rise will not displace America to the sidelines. This new century, unlike the previous one, does not necessarily mean the absolute decline of America, but it will be unmistakable. America will endure a relative decline in the coming 3 decades as Asia, led by China, continue to grow faster than US could. It is a historical force of convergence.
Fred, we're going to have to stop you to keep to our schedule there at the 5-minute limit. I just remind our panelists we've got a timekeeper down here if you kind of keep an eye on them. Thank you very much.
I finished.
Yeah,
my conclusion is clear.
Oh, you finished. Okay, good. Great. It's a bold statement for Asia. I'm so persuaded by it that I'm thinking that not only is Fred not going to be at a disadvantage of the next debate, that in fact it'll be all of us native English speakers that will be at the disadvantage because we'll have to be having it in Mandarin probably. So with that, I will turn it over to Team America to try to, I don't know, come back. Is it possible? Start with Alan.
Well, I agree with Fred Hu that this is primarily an economic question. Will China be the world's dominant economy by 2014? Because that drives the other pieces. And I understand how a superficial analysis could get you to a yes in answering that question. At Fortune, if you look at our list of the global 500 top companies in the world, in the year 2000, only 10 of them were Chinese. This year, 98 were Chinese. It goes to 106 if you include Taiwan. And polls by my former colleagues at the Pew Research Center show that majorities of people in England, France, Canada, and Australia think that China has already passed the United States as the world's dominant economic power. But I think they're wrong. I think Fred is wrong, and I think they will continue to be wrong in 2041. And let me tell you why. Economic power is not just about size, it is about dynamism. England, tiny England, ruled the 19th century because of the incredible developments of the Industrial Revolution, the power loom, the blast furnace, the steam engine. The U.S. Was the dominant economic power in the 20th century because of the managerial capitalism that developed with its greatest companies, the companies that populated the first Fortune 500 list in 1955. General Electric, General Motors, DuPont. And I believe we're now in the midst of another industrial revolution, a great transformation of the very foundations of business and economics that's being driven by a set of technologies: cloud computing, mobile computing, the Internet of Things, data, advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, all of which are rapidly changing the way that business works and the economy works. And I base some of this, by the way, on Kevin Snyder's outfit, McKinsey report, which says that $10 trillion of new economic value will be created in the next decade alone. If you take it out 2 decades, it's probably 3 or 4 times that. Now, here's the question I would ask the audience. Which country do you think will be leading this new industrial revolution? Let's go back to the Fortune Global 500 list that I mentioned before. All these new Chinese companies, the top 12 of those companies are state-owned enterprises. Does anyone in this room think that those companies are going to be the ones that have the vision or bring the innovative creativity to bring about this transformation of business? Or let's put it another way. Does anyone think the Chinese government will allow a kind of Schumpeterian process of creative destruction so that upstarts, private companies can displace those state-owned enterprises in order to create the change in business that's being brought about by these technologies? I do not. Now, there are promising private companies in China, no question about it. I spent yesterday at the campus of Huawei in Shenzhen, and it's very impressive how it has approached the challenge of innovation, partnerships with companies and universities outside of China to make sure it's tapping into the very best thinking. But I believe that's an exception, not the rule. On the other hand, if you look at what's going on in the United States, we have now close to 100 companies referred to as unicorns. These are startups who are exploring ways to use these 2 new technologies to change the way the economy operates. But even more importantly than that, the incumbents, I see I'm running quickly out of time, the incumbents, the big companies, feel these unicorns at their back and are anxious, desperate to transform themselves so they don't get disrupted by someone else. Ginny Rometty, who is the CEO of IBM, has 3 things she tells her employees over and over again. Don't be defined by your products. Don't protect the past. Always disrupt yourself. Again, I ask the audience, have you heard the head of a state-owned enterprise in China speak that way? So here's my prediction for the next 20 years. We will see a massive transformation of the global economy. It will be led by entrepreneurs and business leaders that know they must disrupt or be disrupted. And in 2041, we will wake up to discover that economic dynamism and personal freedom really did turn out to go hand in hand. And because of that, we will continue to live in the American century. And I might move to Hong Kong, Fred, but it won't be for that reason.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Alan. All right. So there you have it. China may be large, but it can't innovate.
Well,
No unicorns. Kevin, how do you respond?
I respond with a few words. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, Xiaomi, Samsung, LG, Flipkart, Wipro, and Tata. I believe these are all Asian powerhouses. I believe they are leaders in each of the sectors in which they compete, and I believe they're all technology companies. I think it is nonsense to say that Asians cannot innovate. I think it's nonsense to say they will not lead in the industries that we have just been discussing. And why is that? It's got many reasons. It's because the fundamental forces we're talking about tonight manifest themselves in economics. But let's talk about what's underneath them. If you are innovating, if you're creating something at scale, it matters what market you're doing that in. And the size means you learn more, you learn it quicker, and you adapt faster. That is why China's internet companies take the American equivalents to the cleaners when it comes to technology. If you compare them like for like and look at underneath the surface, you may not like it, but the reality is these companies here are far more sophisticated with a far broader array of products and are already doing the things that American companies are talking about. Whether it's Alipay and you look at the equivalent in the US, there is a lot to learn from what is happening here. And the reason that's happening, I think, is because the forces which give rise to size actually are also the forces which mean we're returning to what was true in all but the last 3 centuries. Because in all but the last 3 centuries, the center of the world from an economic viewpoint was here in Asia. And the reason why we're going to return to that is because of the following forces. One is demography. It ain't going to change. The demography is on the side of Asia, 4.3 billion people, the world's biggest consumer market. And with that consumer market comes enormous pressure to innovate. And even if your domestic companies don't innovate, where is it that the battle of the car companies is being fought? Partly in the courts with Volkswagen and their emissions, admittedly, but most of it is actually being fought in China. That's where the latest technology is being fought over. It's not being fought over in the US because the car market in the US is smaller. It's not being fought over when it comes to the processes that underpin the way the cars get manufactured. Why? Because the German suppliers need to be at their most efficient here in China. That is what sparks innovation. So demography creates massive markets, 4.3 billion people across Asia, and it's not just China. The second force that's not going to diminish is urbanization. As China and the rest of Asia urbanizes, the economic consequences of that are only just being felt. When somebody is in an urban environment, they spend somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times what they spend elsewhere. And we are seeing a rapid urbanization all across Asia that is still to be played out. By 2030, 70% of Chinese will live in an urban environment compared to the low 50s today. That is a massive change of a scale we can only begin to contemplate. In India, we're going to see somewhere between 300 and 400 million people move into an urban environment. And as they move in, for the first time, they'll have something called disposable income. Disposable income creates enormous pressure to innovate, albeit not at the sexy end of the market, but at the value end of the market. And that is innovation as we know it. Social mobility is happening on a scale we have not seen and will not see in the rest of the world. The middle class is being created as we watch and contemplate it. And that is why companies from across the world are coming to Asia to compete, to learn and to compete. And education, a privilege only the wealthy can afford, that is now being rolled out across Asia. And as that happens, 1.2 million engineers will graduate from China this year. You have to add the next 5 countries together to get to the same number of engineers being produced in 1 year. And time will come when those engineers do have the same quality of education as they get in other parts of the world. You put all that together, and I think you do have a highly innovative economy. Because we need to understand what innovation is. Innovation isn't just what Alan described. There's an awful lot of innovation that happens. Innovation includes innovating in terms of what you deliver to consumers. That's why the internet battle is being fought and won here in Asia. That's why the most sophisticated innovation on the net happens here. The digital economy will be first in Asia because we're leapfrogging the rest of the old fixed line economy and going straight to digital, and enormous innovation has happened. Science-based innovation, that may be the place where America will retain its advantage. But let's think of the other 2 types. Process engineering, continually improving the way things get made, that is absolutely being fought here in Asia, because this is the place where you need to be at your most competitive, because this is the most competitive market in the world. And the last one, which I think was ultimately going to be the rub here, is if we look at all the different forms of creative industry, they're actually now battling here. And that used to be the preserve of America. So my actual closing thought for you to consider is that actually what's happening now is the age of Ultron, a movie that I'm sure you all flocked to see, the new Avengers movie, or for that matter, Fast and Furious 7, took more here in China And if you watch, we're continually adapted and evolved to meet the needs of the Chinese market. And that was innovation in America's most proud industry, the movie industry. I'm sorry, Alan, but the forces are against you. Demographics, urbanization, the middle class, education and innovation. That's Asia, and that's the future.
Thank you, Kevin. Wow. Economics, technology, innovation, even Hollywood. We've covered it all, except for your specialty, Professor Zhang, military hardware. What's
I think
ahead for us?
we need to move beyond an economic conception of power. China's economic rise is no doubt impressive, but is that sufficient to buttress a so-called China rules the world scenario? The American century, I would say, is not only based on innovation, technology, economic might, but also on military might. Americans, we tend to think Americans' conception of internal relations is very liberal. In reality, America is the most realist country on earth. America's global dominance is based on the military dominance. It has the biggest military. Its military budget is bigger than the next 10 countries combined. And so, unfortunately for China, I think one of the biggest changes we're witnessing in front of our eyes is the change of mode of internal relations from a liberal mode to a realist mode. Until a few years ago, I think after the end of the Cold War, the globalization dominated the theme. Liberal schemes like interdependence, globalization, technology diffusion, global governance, they shaped pretty much internal relations from early 1990s to just a few years ago. In that kind of a liberal international system, economic power, trade power, they dominate. We can say economic power is the daily currency of power. Okay. Unfortunately, in the past few years, the mode of internal relations is reverting back, unfortunately, to the realist model, which is defined by great power competition, security competition. In such a realist model, every day, the headline is China's military parade, nuclear deterrence, Japan's security posture revisionism, U.S. strategic rebalancing, Korean Peninsula crisis. As some have said, geopolitics have returned. Okay, so in this kind of international system, which is really unfortunate, okay, that means our future may not be different from the 19th century. Okay, security competition, security rivalry. Those are the central issues. And on those issues, military power decides outcomes. Okay, America's military advantage is undisputed. Okay, Chinese military is catching up, but the gap is still huge. Okay, and also in such an international system, alliances are vital for sustaining a great power's global influence, and that's again is a huge American advantage. United States has how many allies? We don't even know because there are too many of them, right? How many allies does China have? Just one, and that's a fake alliance. That's an alliance with North Korea. Okay, and so most importantly, United States is turning Japan, which is by itself a great power, a country with tremendous latent power, into a very important strategic ally. Okay, so Abe's reposturing of Japan will add tremendous weight to the overall U.S. power. So the U.S. security dominance will probably last for, I would argue, at least 3 to 4 decades. So we need to move beyond an economic conception of power and economic conception of a world order. Okay, unfortunately, we do live. I think we're reverting back to the realist model. Okay, military power dominates.
Wow, great arguments on all sides. Thank you. So we are in this era where we're beyond economics. America is more powerful, more realistic, has more friends, and that's not likely to change. Fred, your turn for a 3-minute rebuttal.
I'm an economist, okay, but I'm totally unconvinced by Professor Zhang's argument on military strength and the so-called allies, okay? Our military, if a military determines everything, the Mongols are running the world right now, okay? It is true, today, there's enormous gap between Chinese military strength and the U.S., right? There's no other rival to U.S. We will accept that. But where does this power come from? It's U.S. economy, okay? Look at the congressional budget debate. is how much they can allocate dollar into the defense program, okay, acquisition, latest technology, weaponry. Without a booming economy, this advantage can be eroded over time. Before 1991, okay, under the Cold War, the former Soviet Union had almost military parity with the US, right? Why Soviet Union can also there are other institutional political reasons, but also importantly economic, just could not keep up with the US, right? So again, going back, the economic foundation is the everything of all other power we talk about. Even military, as powerful, as high-tech as the US military is, it has severe limits. Let's remind ourselves, just in the last half century, when America ruled the world, Korean Peninsula is still a stalemate. America military didn't achieve the full goal. Vietnam almost torn the country apart, okay? Your absolute supremacy didn't really win the war. Iraq, what a mess today, right? Arguably, the region is worse than it was when US achieved stunning military success. It has severe limits. Of course, in today's world, the new threat, stateless terrorism, ISIS, climate change, pandemics, they just kind of bomb them away to the solution. Okay. Now, so-called allies. Okay, of course, through 100 years, especially after World War II, America built these wonderful institutions, NATO, and treaty with Japan, and this and that. Okay, China is like India. We always pursue the non-allied movement. Okay, we want to be friends with everyone, not just with our allies. And even this ally, there's a fracture, there's divergence of interest. Let's say, think of the AIAB. America overtly pressured every single its ally, from Britain to France to Australia to South Korea. Don't follow Beijing, okay? Resist, boycott the AIB. You know what? All these staunchest allies all followed Beijing. Soft power matters, okay? Converging interest matters, okay? So again, all this, we still, under Professor Zhang, all the gap he mentions now, okay, wait another 30 years, who knows? The gap will be vastly closed, if not even overtaken. So, go back to our conclusion. Kevin Dai, the coming century, Asian century.
Very good. Excellent. All right, Alan, falls to you.
Kevin Sneeder made a clever turn by talking broadly about Asia rather than narrowly about China. But my colleague, Professor Zhang, I think pretty clearly showed the weakness in that argument. When Japan, South Korea, the Philippines are aligned with the United States and not with China, talking about Asia as a whole doesn't make a lot of sense. If you go back specifically to China and address the demographic question, China is actually on the losing side of the demographic argument. Today, the average age of the Chinese population is younger than the U.S. By 2041, that will flip and flip pretty dramatically. So demographics is on our side in this argument. Now, one of the great economists of the 20th century was Joseph Schumpeter, who talked about the process of creative destruction, that in order to advance economies have to both innovate but also allow the old to fall by the wayside. The problem in China, I concede that there is great innovation going on. I mentioned Huawei, Alibaba, Baidu. The problem in China is that you have to have both sides of the creative destruction equation operating. The society has to be willing to allow the dinosaurs, the state-owned enterprises, to fall by the wayside, not protect them, not coddle them, in order to allow the business innovation to actually occur. You need a culture that will protect intellectual property, and I believe at the end of the day, you need a culture that will encourage the kind of personal freedom and personal exploration that has fed the kind of innovation you see happening in Silicon Valley in the United States. At the end of the day, China may get there. China may get there. China will not get there by 2041.
Good. Kevin.
So here's the issue. on this side of the House and the other side of the House, we have the defenders of the existing architecture that has ruled the world for the last 2 or 3 centuries. And that's what's being challenged. It's an assumption that the way to innovate lies in this creative destruction model. It's a bunch of venture capitalists who raise some money and go off and do great things with a couple of hero entrepreneurs. That ain't Asia, it ain't China, it ain't Japan, it ain't Korea. It's not the model that's actually driven those powerhouse economies outside of China. There is a very different approach. And what is happening is that approach now has the upper hand. Let me just offer a few examples of why that is the case. As Fred said, let's just take the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It took them 3 months to get 57 countries, 34 of which were close American allies, to sign up. It took the UK all of 3 days to lead that charge. The days when America can tell its allies what to do, gone. And it wasn't just the AIIB, OBOR. I defy anyone to explain what on earth it actually is, because every time I hear a Chinese bureaucrat try and explain it, I am baffled. But 65 nations signed up, pledged real money, and have committed to One Belt, One Road and the Maritime Silk Road that goes with it. Of those 65, at least half are close American allies. The architecture that governed this world has gone. And it's gone because it is recognizing the fact that there are many ways in which nations can thrive. They don't have to thrive on the back of absolute military might. It is the case the US will probably, until 2041 and way beyond it, have the largest military force on this earth. But I think it's also true to say that they'll face off against some other pretty powerful military forces. And what's actually going to matter here is indeed the way in which the economic models evolve. My hope is they actually evolve in a sympathy, where actually what we recognize is that China's model is just as valid as the Western model. And that model has at its core many of the aspects of capitalism, but it doesn't call it that. The number of SOEs that have gone out of business in this part of the world is enormous. Enormous. The notion that somehow or other they haven't is laughable. The 12 that you talk about in the Fortune list are a very different 12 from those that used to exist. They are national champions often, but they often have in them cross-holdings with private companies, semi-owned, state-owned enterprises, a whole array of models which today are benefiting from the market in which they compete, but more importantly are winning overseas. And if you look at where those companies compete, they're competing in very competitive markets around the world and doing quite well. Why is that? Because ultimately, the soft power that America enjoyed was indeed anchored on its economics. And just have a look at where soft power is being exercised now. Africa. Africa will be the next part of the world that modernizes. The middle class is already rising. Who's the biggest investor in Africa? It's not the United States. It used to be. And it is in South Africa, but that's not what we're talking about. In the rest of Africa, it's China. And a whole group of business people are growing up knowing that the people you do business with are Chinese. That's where the capital comes from. That's where the innovation comes from. The model has moved on. In market after market, China provides the capital. In market after market, people meet Chinese business leaders who are there to partner with them. And that's why so many of them are in the United States right now with the president. The model has changed. It's time to recognize that model has changed, accept it, and the world will be a better place. Because if the only argument for supporting the notion that America will remain the dominant economy in 2041 is anchored in its military prowess, then we probably have a bigger problem to debate tonight, the one which I think we should debate, which is an economic power has returned to where it came from, Asia, the power that was for 18 of the last 20 centuries.
Thank you, Kevin. Professor Zhang, you get the last statement here.
I think, again, we have to come back to the notion of power. So far, we have been analyzing mostly the so-called materialistic aspects of power. So my panelists now mentioned about the technological power, economic power. I emphasized another kind of a materialistic power, military power. But we need to move beyond that. In 2012, the U.S. National Intelligence Council released the official report of its own prediction of future power trajectories of the major countries. And it uses I said there are two ways to measure power. One is the traditional elements of power approach. Elements of power approach means you focus on a few big materialistic factors, like the 4 factor they use: population, GDP size, military spending, R&D spending. According to that model, China will converge with the United States in total power by 2030. But the National Intelligence Council said we need to move beyond this traditional understanding of power. We must expand the notion of power by including additional non-materialistic elements. For example, governance. Governance is critical. Governance quality is critical. Health, education, for example. According to this expanded notion of power, the National Intelligence Council predicts convergence somewhere after 2045. The reason is that the West and the US in specific has intrinsic advantages in governance. Okay, China, I think the Chinese leadership understands the issue much better than anybody else. President Xi Jinping's principal reform target is to first eliminate corruption, abuse of power, because China's governance quality is very lousy. Okay, and secondly, he has a specific proposal called the 国家管制能力的现代化, which means modernization of governance capacity, because China doesn't have an advanced, sophisticated, rule-based governance system. All of those weakens China's power internally. And so not too long ago, American scholar David Shambaugh wrote a piece, China is on the verge of collapse, largely because of internal problems. It's a governance interpretation of China's power. So when some people predict China's convergence with the US, even surpassing the US, other people are predicting from the opposite end. There could be an implosion. I actually disagree with his view. I wrote a piece for the Global Asia at the website. I challenge his view. It's a kind of a doomsday scenario, and I don't think China is on the verge of collapse. China's system is still pretty robust, but on the other hand, its governance system has problems, and President Xi Jinping understands that better than anybody else. Okay, so there's a Harvard professor called Niall Ferguson. He wrote a book. He tried to answer the same question: will the West catch up with the West? Will them end Western dominance? And his view is that Western dominance will continue, partly because, if not mainly because, West advantages in good governance. Only Western countries have good governance. Okay, other countries, even if they are democracies like Malaysia, okay, could be corrupt, incompetent. Government's abuse of power is rampant. So I think if we have a different conception of power by including this domestic dimension, we think China's weakness is abound, and American strength probably will continue for quite a while.
Thank you very much. We've heard impressive and compelling arguments on all sides here. These are two excellent rounds of statements. I want to get to the vote to see which side has changed views. But before we do that, I want to try to allow for some questions from the audience. And I'd like to do this, if we can, in a relatively structured way. I'd like to ask members of the audience that have questions to ask your question to only one panelist and try to limit your question to a question, not a statement, and have it be only a question, one question, not a multi-part, four-part, subheaded question. Let's give them really thoughtful, profound questions that you think will really give them a chance to shift the argument one way or another. I see a hand back here.
My name's Glenn Schloss. I'm with Huawei. Why do we have to approach this from a question of dominance or rivalry? What about
I
prosperity?
accept full responsibility.
They made us. We were not given that choice.
Ponder, and the question's for Fred. Can we think about it? Can I ask Fred to address that? What about co-prosperity or collaboration?
I'm not sure we would use the word co-prosperity. Collaboration is a good word.
Well, maybe I think we expect the two superpowers to cooperate, for the common good of the mankind. Unfortunately, great powers, the logic of great power politics is strategic rivalry. That's the angle of so-called the tragedy of great power politics, precisely because they live in a system of anarchy. They are each wary of each other's power. So the rise of Chinese power scares the Americans, and American hegemony scares the Chinese. So this kind of structurally induced mutual mistrust is unfortunately the way of life. Okay. And in addition to pure mutual mistrust, they also have, I would say, they do have zero-sum issues. Okay. For example, the Bretton Woods system, post-World War II global governance system architecture is American-made. It highlights American dominance. And the Chinese, other great powers, inevitably, they don't want it. So the Chinese would have to start something new. We now have a term for that called the parallel institutions. Chinese are slowly, patiently building up a parallel structure. And that, again, put them in a zero-sum situation because influence is zero-sum. Influence means only one person has it, right? If we all have influence, that means nobody has influence. So once the Chinese build a parallel structure to compete with the Bretton Woods system, they effectively weaken the Americans. So that's really the tragedy. Great powers always compete with each other, or either out of mutual fear or out of quest for glory, for international influence.
Great answer. Well, thank you. Let's take the woman in red here. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, what is the worst case scenario that you see coming from this U.S.-China rivalry, and what kind of probability you see that happening?
And who's your question for?
I think all people can answer.
Yeah, anyone who can answer. Thank you.
Anyone who can answer. Worst case, does someone want to take a shot at the worst case scenario?
Well, I think the worst case scenario is you end up with a military solution that nobody wants. But I think it comes back to two things. It's worth remembering that about 30% of America's exports are headed right here, right now, and America has a massive economic interest in this part of the world. At the same time, China has an enormous interest. 60% of the world's aluminium comes to China. 46% of the world's steel. 20% of the world's wheat. 30% of cotton. So we are absolutely interdependent from an economic viewpoint. So whilst I understand the political theory issue, I hope that what's happened is the world is just too interconnected for these powers to get to a place where they actually fight each other militarily. But I think the risk is that one of their allies triggers a conflict and they find themselves somehow reacting. You do worry about America, Taiwan, China, Japan. It's that axis that worries me more than a direct conflict between China and the US. But you could absolutely paint pictures of a direct scenario too. I just feel they're much less likely than something inadvertently triggering a conflict. And then we rely on the world leaders to step back.
Very quickly, you want to just add to that? Yeah.
I add a little bit on that. I think the best case scenario is the liberal vision. Interconnectedness, interdependence discourage motives for war. And encourages cooperation. But unfortunately, as some have pointed out, World War I happened in that age of interdependence. Actually, German and the Brits, their also European powers, their economic connection actually was quite deep. And so that didn't prevent the outbreak of World War I. And are we qualitatively different today? Maybe not. Because states do part of their national strategies are not driven by economic considerations. They are driven by pure security considerations. And so that's why U.S. alliance commitment could be a trigger to get the two countries in war. But fortunately, I have to say, we also live in a new age, which is different from World War I age, and that is we do have nuclear weapons on both sides. That is a very ugly scenario, but mutual nuclear deterrence, unfortunately, may be the last resort to prevent a Sino-US conflict.
That is the worst case scenario, isn't it? We have a question in the front here. Yes.
Question for Alan. A cursory review of history suggests that the biggest constraint on future innovation is vested interests. We can all cite many of those around the world, but how ready is the US middle class to make way for the coming technological revolution, and what are the political implications of that?
Great question.
Yeah, no, it is a very good question. I mean, you do see the rise of concern among the middle class, the increasing inequality, which I believe is driven by technological innovation. But to date, the country has been willing to tolerate it and continue to tolerate it. And one of the interesting things about the mess that is currently American politics is that the technology community actually aligns more closely with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So while I think that could be a problem at some point in the future, I don't think it will prevent the process of innovation and creative destruction that we're talking about over the course of the next 20 years, and that was described in the report that McKinsey put out about the Internet of Things.
I'm going to exercise the chairman's prerogative here and ask for somebody who's got a question for Fred, so we give equal time to all of our panelists. You've got one for Fred? Yes, okay.
The U.S. is still a dominant country today in that it attracts the world's best talents in every single sector. Many of you here attended graduate schools in the U.S. Do you see this changing if China becomes a dominant economy in the future? Will China have the capacity to attract the world's best talents instead of the U.S.?
Great question. So educational institutions are a key part of this soft power element that Joe and I talked about. Is that going to shift as well?
Great question. So we talk about innovation, talk about technology, economic supremacy. Of course, derived from human capital, right? Of course, the Americans also share cash revolution, a lot of natural resources, but that's not a decisive factor. Otherwise, Africa, Latin America would be long dominating the world. Okay, human capital is the key. So America's place to have the world's best higher education system, which I'm part of, beneficiary of, and I admire and appreciate. But you look at the history. American preeminence in higher education is not a God-given. It's not like it's actually very recent phenomenon. Okay, Harvard, the institution I went to, didn't really achieve world claim until probably 1900 or afterwards when Charles Eliot became president. Before then, of course, Oxbridge and German universities actually, account probably more than half of the top 10 global universities. But America, invested in higher education, unique system attract talent, particularly after World War II or before World War II, when Nazi Germany drove all the best scientists from Europe, the Jewish scientists, including Albert Einstein, to America. So then, fully established the performance. And Stanford, what's until the point was really a young institution, pretty much unknown. Now, of course, now it's among the pinnacle. So China now is just starting. Last 20, 30 years, there's been aggressive investment in higher education. So now we have world's largest higher education industry. Okay, 35 million current enrollments, of whom 11 million are science engineering. Okay, each year, I think Kevin mentioned earlier, 2.8 million graduates in science engineering alone. Okay, so right now I think the gap is still very big. That's why the Times, it's not the Fortune ranking top 100. American 45. China has only 2, Tsinghua and Beida. But 30 years from now, things could change and could change dramatically. That doesn't mean the US will totally surrender its supremacy, but China will probably, close the gap much more significantly than right now.
It's also just a bit of a myth to think that China hasn't already started. You go to Tsinghua, Schwarzman Scholars, you see an array of international companies represented, people definitely trying to get there. This movement has already started. And interestingly, the equal and opposite effect, the UK putting limits on student visas, the US talking about the same, the anti-immigration sentiment. Let's just see how this plays out. I think there'll be plenty of international students at major Chinese universities. Already are, and there'll be more.
Thank you, Kevin. Just one more point to add that. American education, we think top supremacy is really the higher education. Secondary, primary, particularly some of the public school in some inner cities, I think there's still a long way to go. There's some significant issue in terms of science, literacy, computer, math. This is not like my vertical. I'm not an education specialist. It's a PISA, OECD, survey after survey, right? Many of the American public school students' math and science skills are pretty appalling. So Harvard is great.
Harvard's great.
It's great, but
wow. I think this debate has suddenly morphed into a debate about is the Harvard century giving away to the Tsinghua century.
Here.
Well, listen, I know that people are anxious to get to other engagements tonight. I promised that we would get you out of here exactly at 8:15. We are now at 8:10. And so the moment of truth has come to vote on the resolution. If you don't mind, I'll read it for you again. Give it some thought before you cast your vote. Here it is. Resolved. The American century will give way to the Asian century on or before the year 2041. Show of hands. Who thinks that resolution is true? Voting for the Asian century. How many people? Have we not changed anybody's mind? We don't have a way of telling who's changed their mind. It might be.
I would just point out that all the people who just left were on the negative side.
Okay. Natalie, what do we think? What's our head count? 42.
It's
Down from
fallen.
45. Okay. So, on the other side, people who think that the American century will persist. They don't believe that the Asian century will rise. Wow, it really may come down to those three people that snuck out the
They all
back.
left.
Wow, this is really close.
Including the rep.
Do you have any hanging chads here? I don't know. It's just 54. The American century skates by. Wow, thank you very much. And I want to really thank our panelists. I think the closeness of the vote really demonstrates how keenly argued it was, how well argued it was on both sides. I want to thank our speakers here for being so indulgent of our premise and arguing so vehemently for their positions, even though they have much more complex worldviews. Please join me again in giving them a big round of applause. And thank you as an audience for your wonderful, wonderful questions, which brought out some excellent points.